Jack Miles had always believed in playing fair. After 30 years in civil engineering and a quiet early retirement, he thought he had found his peace on the shores of Clearwater Lake. The property was everything he'd worked for, modest, but charming house nestled along the water, with a handmade wooden dock that had weathered years of seasons. It wasn't extravagant, just right. But the HOA had other ideas. One frosty January morning, Jack opened his mailbox to find an envelope that felt heavier than usual. Inside was a notice from the Clearwater Shores Homeowners Association. 3 pages long, printed in a smug serif font. It outlined a violation of the newly enacted waterfront appearance regulation. According to the board, Jack's dock was visually inconsistent with the community's updated standards. He had 14 days to remove it. If he failed to comply, he'd face daily fines starting at $100 and compounding. Jack's brow furrowed. The dock had stood there for years. Built by the previous owner, it was practically part of the landscape. He'd even seen neighborhood kids casting lines off its edge, and teenagers taking prom pictures at sunset. What could have suddenly made it unacceptable? He called the HOA's office, but the number led straight to voicemail. He left a message, then another. Silence. 2 days later, a second envelope arrived. The fine schedule was now in effect. What disturbed Jack most wasn't the fine itself, it was the arrogance behind it. He flipped through his files that evening, retrieving the house's deed and site plans. He wanted to be sure the dock hadn't crossed any lines. As he reviewed the documents, a detail on the land plat caught his eye. According to the original property records, his land didn't stop at the shoreline. It extended into the water. Technically, Jack owned not just his lot, but a wedge-shaped section beneath the lake's surface. A curiosity, maybe. But something about it nagged at him. He took a drive to the clubhouse, the heart of the HOA's operations. It sat across the lake from his home, built in modern stone and glass. A dock extended behind it, leading to a cluster of rental paddleboards and kayaks. Nearby, families splashed in a resort-style pool, and teens lounged in shaded cabanas. Jack had never used it, preferring his quiet dock and the view it offered. Now, standing there, he noticed something else. That side of the lake, those amenities were partially sitting over water that his deed might include. At the next HOA meeting, Jack tried to reason with them. He waded through budget updates, landscaping disputes, and an absurd debate over mailbox colors. When it was finally time for homeowner comments, he stood and calmly asked about the dock. Martin Blake, the HOA president, barely glanced at him. Slicked back hair, a designer polo shirt, and the kind of smirk that only comes from unchecked power. He told Jack the dock was a relic, and the community had moved on. The vote had been passed. Uniform docks only. No exceptions. Jack offered to modify the dock. Martin dismissed the idea. You're out of compliance. Either tear it down, or the fines keep rolling. Someone laughed. Jack stared back, eyes cold. You're sure about that? Dead sure, Martin said, looking past him. Next question. Dead. Night. Jack stood at the edge of his dock, staring out at the moonlit water. Something didn't sit right. This wasn't about appearance. It was a message. A warning. But they had picked the wrong man to push. Jack went back inside, spread the county maps across his kitchen table, and ran his fingers along the borders of his property into the lake bed. Beneath the resort, under their docks, if they wanted to. Play games with water rights, Jack thought grimly. He could play too. Only difference, he came prepared. The next morning, Jack woke up with a mission. He wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions. His career had trained him to verify every line, every footnote, every measurement, and that's exactly what he intended to do down to the last inch of Clearwater Lake. If he was going to fight the HOA, he needed more than anger. He needed facts. And facts, he knew, would speak louder than threats. He returned to the county clerk's office. The building was quiet, the air stale and still. Inside, rows of file cabinets and digitized plat maps lined the walls like silent sentinels. Jack provided his parcel number and asked to see the complete property history. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses and a curious glance, printed out a stack of papers, nearly half an inch thick. Jack sat down at one of the old wooden tables, highlighter in hand, and began combing through it. It didn't take long to find the language he remembered. In the original purchase agreement, 1987, the lot had been designated with riparian boundaries extending into the adjacent body of water. A shaded diagram confirmed it. His land formed a peninsula-shaped wedge, reaching almost 40 feet into the lake. It was subtle, but clear. Legally, the lake bed beneath that section was his. He cross-referenced it with the HOA's own community development plan, which had been filed years after. And that's when the pieces started to fall into place. The resort-style clubhouse, complete with a marina, had been constructed right over water that partially sat on his land. Not just a corner, but the entire southwestern edge where paddleboard rentals and boat docks were most active. Jack's land had become the foundation of the HOA's golden goose, and they'd never asked permission. He sat back in stunned silence. All this time, they had been fining him for a dock, but the HOA was profiting off his submerged property. Rentals, events, membership fees, even weddings hosted beside the glistening water filmed from a dock that now seemed criminally misplaced. Jack returned home and immediately called an old friend from his engineering days, Marcus, who now specialized in land use law. He explained everything: the letter, the dock, the deed, the map. Marcus listened without interrupting, then, finally, said, "If they're using your land without an easement or a lease agreement, you've got them by the throat." Jack could feel his pulse quicken. "How strong is this?" Marcus replied, "If what you're saying is true, they've been squatting on your submerged land and collecting money from it. That's not just unethical, it's actionable." Jack paced the room, trying to contain the surge of energy coursing through him. "So I could shut them down." "Not just shut them down," Marcus said. "You could sue them into the Stone Age." But Jack wasn't thinking lawsuit. Not yet. He didn't want compensation. He didn't want revenge. He wanted them to realize they were vulnerable, to understand that the man they tried to bully into submission could flip the table at any time. He hung up the phone and looked out at the lake again. A motorboat cruised lazily across the water, leaving small ripples that reached all the way to his shoreline. Just beyond, he could see the marina docks lined with kayaks, paddle boats, and grinning tourists. They had no idea their lake fun was sitting on someone else's land. Jack grabbed a pen and began drafting a letter. Not a complaint, not a plea, warning. They had crossed the line. But he was just getting started. Jack didn't want to fight dirty. Not yet. But if the HOA wanted to play games, he would let them know exactly how dangerous their game board really was. That night, he printed his letter. No threats. No bluster. Just a clean clinical notice to the Board of Clearwater Shores HOA. This letter serves as formal notice that your association's use of the waterline facilities, docks, and recreational services located on the southwestern edge of Clearwater Lake currently rests over property legally deeded to me. Unless a shared use agreement is negotiated within 15 business days, I will proceed with enforcement of my rights under the applicable riparian and land use laws. He signed it, made 6 copies, and delivered them personally the next morning, 1 to each board member's mailbox, and 1 certified to the HOA's attorney of record. Then he waited. The silence was predictable, not even a phone call. But Jack wasn't surprised. He'd seen men like Martin Blake before, swaggering control freaks who didn't respond to logic, only to pressure. Jack had hoped the letter would prompt a conversation. Instead, it was treated like a challenge. Exactly 1 week later, a new envelope arrived, this one even thicker. They'd doubled his fine $200 a day, and they added a late penalty, $1,400. He blinked at the figure, barely believing the audacity. Attached was a grainy photo of his dock, taken from across the lake, with a red arrow pointing to the non-compliant structure. No acknowledgement of the letter. No mention of the property dispute. Just a blatant message. We don't care what you think you own. Jack placed the envelope down and exhaled slowly. It was no longer about the dock. It was about disrespect. 2 days later, he met Marcus at a diner in town. Over coffee and maps, they outlined the next move. Jack didn't want to file a lawsuit, yet it was expensive, slow, and he wanted results. Something visual, immediate. "What about this?" Marcus asked, pointing at the lake bed lines. "Your property line cuts under the clubhouse dock and part of their paddleboard launch." Jack nodded. "If I drained the water just to myself, wouldn't be trespass." Marcus hesitated. "It's unorthodox, but legal. You'd need a controlled drainage permit, and you can't endanger wildlife or public access. But you can reclaim submerged land if it's on your deed, especially if it's for inspection, repair, or non-commercial use." Jack leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Then let's prepare to reclaim." He filed for the permit under routine maintenance. Quietly, officially, he stated he needed to inspect erosion damage on his lakebed. No red flags, no questions. It was approved in 5 days. Next, he hired a hydrologist, a soft-spoken woman named Dana who had worked with Jack years ago. She inspected the lake bank, studied flow rates, and laid out a simple plan. A small crew with temporary pumps and barriers could safely reduce water levels in Jack's section of the lake within 48 hours without disrupting the rest. It would be subtle at first, but enough to expose what was buried beneath. Jack scheduled the crew for Monday morning, just before dawn. On Sunday night, he sat alone on the dock, the water calm and silver beneath the moonlight. He thought about the first morning he moved here, full of peace, hope, and the idea that retirement might finally mean rest. Now, he was on the edge of war, but not the kind with shouting matches or picket signs. This was precision. This was method. This was a scalpel, not a hammer. And at sunrise, they would finally see who they were dealing with. The pumps started humming at 5:12. A.M.2 trucks rolled quietly down Jack's driveway and parked near the water's edge. The crew moved like shadows, professional, quick, discreet. Jack stood nearby with coffee in hand, watching as temporary barriers were slid into the water, and hoses began siphoning water from his portion of the lake into drainage tanks. later, to be diverted to approved runoff areas. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. By 10 a.m. the first muddy ridges of lakebed began to show. By noon, half a dozen HOA members were on his driveway, shouting questions. Why are you draining the lake? Is this allowed? You're damaging the whole ecosystem. Jack didn't answer. He handed them copies of the county permit, clipped to a legal summary of his property boundaries. He said nothing else. By evening, the southwestern side of Clearwater Lake looked like someone had peeled off a layer of its skin. Docks now floated crookedly. Paddleboards sat on cracked mud. The marina was in chaos. The following day, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Jack didn't attend, but his phone rang 3 times each from a different board member. He let it go to voicemail. He wanted them to squirm, but they didn't squirm. They retaliated. The next morning, a notice was taped to Jack's door in a plastic sleeve. The HOA was placing a lien on his home. According to the document, he owed $11,200 in accrued fines, penalties, and unapproved environmental interference. If he didn't pay within 60 days, they would initiate foreclosure. Jack read the papers slowly. Once, then again, this was their big move. The board wasn't going to back down. They were going to try to ruin him, but in doing so, they made a critical mistake. Jack called Marcus immediately. They're filing a lien, he said calmly. I think it's time to push harder. That same afternoon, Marcus filed a cease and desist with the county along with a lawsuit claiming unlawful encroachment, private land use without permission, and unlicensed commercial activity over Jack's property. Attached were drone images of the drained area, complete with coordinates, timestamps, and evidence that the HOA docks were anchored directly into land Jack owned. But the nail in the coffin came from Dana, the HYDROLOGIST. During the draining process, her team discovered steel anchors and underground stabilizers cemented into the lakebed. These weren't just floating docks, they were illegally affixed to land the HOA didn't own. Worse yet, electrical wiring from the clubhouse extended underwater into lighting fixtures on the marina. None of it was permitted. All of it ran through Jack's property. That's code violation, Dana said. If one of those lines fails, someone could be electrocuted. Jack forwarded the findings to the county inspector. Within 48 hours, Clearwater Shores received a formal citation. The marina was deemed unsafe and ordered to shut down pending investigation. It wasn't just a PR nightmare, it was financial devastation. The HOA's precious resort, the crown jewel of their community image, was now roped off with caution tape and patrolled by county officials. Bookings were canceled, rentals refunded. Furious emails flooded the board's inbox. Still, no one called Jack to apologize. Instead, Martin Blake held a press conference in front of the clubhouse and called Jack a vindictive property owner, exploiting loopholes to sabotage the community. Jack watched it from his living room. Calm as ever. He turned off the TV, stepped outside, and walked to the edge of the exposed lakebed. The wind was picking up now. The air smelled of damp clay and dying algae. He smiled, just slightly, they thought. They were burying him under fines, but all they'd done was dig deeper into land he owned. And now, they were drowning in it. It started with a single headline: Local HOA resort shut down after property dispute turns legal within hours. The story spread across neighborhood forums and regional news sites. Jack didn't say a word to the press. He didn't have to. The sight of a half-drained lake, the boarded-up clubhouse, and the caution tape fluttering across the once bustling marina told the story all on its own. But Jack was far from finished. He met with Dana early Monday morning to finalize Phase 2. The first drainage had exposed enough of the lakebed to prove ownership, stir panic, and attract legal scrutiny. Now it was time to finish what the HOA had started by making sure they had no lake left to stand on. Jack filed a second permit for full water level reduction. This time, he cited ecological restoration. Native reeds had been displaced, shoreline erosion was evident, and sediment samples showed chemical runoff from the HOA's boat cleaning stations. Every word was true, every document was real. The permit was granted again. 2 days later, the heavy pumps arrived. 3 industrial units positioned at strategic corners of Jack's shoreline began to pull thousands of gallons of water per hour, day and night. They ran the once reflective surface of Clearwater Lake, dimmed, lowered, then vanished like a slow-motion curtain being pulled away from a stage. Locals gathered across the street to watch the transformation. Children pointed, reporters took drone footage. The story exploded. Homeowner drains lake in battle with HOA $4 million. Clubhouse rests on stolen land. Lawsuit alleges David versus Goliath story unfolds in Clearwater Shores inside the HOA's gated offices. Panic reached a boiling point. Jack could imagine the boardroom, Martin Blake pacing, staffers sweating, phone calls unanswered. The clubhouse manager resigned. The poolside bartenders were laid off. The HOA hotline had a wait time of over 40 minutes, but the lake kept draining. On the third day, something extraordinary happened. As water receded further, the remains of old concrete posts appeared near the shoreline beneath the clubhouse deck. Dana's team identified them as anchors for temporary structures that were never supposed to be permanent. Apparently, the HOA had cut corners during construction, skipping proper permitting in favor of speed and aesthetics. Those concrete posts, installed with reinforcing rods illegally, drilled into the lake bed Jack owned. County investigators, already annoyed by the board's evasiveness, didn't need more motivation. They ordered a full inspection of all HOA lakefront improvements, where crews arrived the next morning and began tearing up decking, photographing violations, and interviewing residents. Then came the bombshell. An anonymous whistleblower from the HOA's own management office leaked financial reports showing the association had generated over $20,000 annually from rental and event income directly tied to the marina, none of which had been disclosed in official filings. That revenue stream relied entirely on Jack's land. The HOA had not only built on private property, they had profited from it without consent, license, or acknowledgement. It was textbook trespassing, possibly criminal. Jack's attorney filed an amended claim, seeking damages not just for encroachment or lost use, but for backdated rent 10 years' worth of illegal profits. That number? $2.8 million. Still, Jack wasn't celebrating. He sat on his porch each night, sipping coffee, listening to the hum of the pumps. It wasn't joy he felt, it was balance. What they had taken from him, he had reclaimed. Not with fists, not with revenge, not with facts, with law, with patience. On day 5, the lake was nearly gone. Just a narrow vein of muddy water snaked along, the lake bed like a scar. The clubhouse loomed above it, silent, dry, and lifeless. Jack stood at the edge, breathing in the silence, the wind tugging gently at his jacket. Let them call him petty, let them cry foul. All he'd done was remove the water. They were the ones who chose to build their empire on something they didn't own. The summons arrived on a Thursday, thick, glossy, and self-important. The HOA had filed suit against Jack Miles in civil court, alleging malicious property damage, defamation, and interference with community operations. The list of accusations stretched 5 pages. Jack read it all without flinching. They were trying to flip the script in the face of their own violations. They'd resorted to the oldest defense in the book. The accuser, Marcus, Jack's attorney, wasn't surprised. They're stalling, he said, trying to change the optics, make you look like the villain. Jack smiled faintly. Then, let's give them an audience. He filed a counterclaim that same day. The suit was surgical documented trespassing, unlicensed commercial use, illegal construction, and 10 years of backdated rent. He added the recent lien as unlawful retaliation and bad faith. Evidence stacked like bricks. Property surveys, time-stamped drone footage, official permits, environmental reports, eyewitness testimony, and the anonymous HOA whistleblower's financial leak. The case was scheduled for hearing in just under 6 weeks. Word spread fast. By the time Jack stepped into the county courthouse, the gallery was packed. Residents, reporters, legal interns, even HOA members not on the board. Clearwater Shores was divided. Some saw Jack as a troublemaker. Others quietly thanked him for standing up to what they'd long suspected. A board that operated without accountability. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for hating wasted time, opened proceedings swiftly. The HOA's attorney started. Martin Blake entered the courtroom wearing a pressed blue suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He sat behind his counsel, arms folded, eyes locked forward, as if willing the storm to pass with posture alone. He'd ruled the HOA like a miniature kingdom for nearly a decade, and now, his throne was trembling. Inside, the judge listened as the HOA's legal team opened with accusations of sabotage. They called Jack's actions reckless, disruptive, and motivated by personal spite. They claimed the lake drainage had endangered property values and public safety, and framed the entire incident as a calculated campaign to dismantle the community's peace. Jack didn't flinch. His turn came next. Marcus stood calmly before the bench and began laying out their evidence with the ease of a seasoned litigator. First, the property deed showing Jack's lakebed ownership. Then the county-approved permits, submitted and approved under full compliance. Then came the drone footage, documenting the encroachment. Finally, financial reports proving the HOA had earned more than $300,000 a year in revenue from facilities built on Jack's property. That alone might have been enough. But then Marcus introduced a surprise exhibit, an internal HOA email chain, leaked by the anonymous whistleblower. The chain revealed that the board had known about the potential property line issue 2 years prior. Instead of investigating, they had voted to ignore it and proceed with development, noting that no one's going to drain the damn lake. Silence filled the room. Martin's face turned pale. The judge leaned back in her chair and narrowed her eyes at the defense. Did the board knowingly build on land it didn't own? The HOA's attorney stammered. We were under the impression the lakebed belonged to the association. Even after that email, the judge snapped, holding up the printed pages. You chose not to verify. By the time closing arguments ended, it was clear which direction the tide was turning. The judge recessed for deliberation but returned. In under 20 minutes with her ruling, she dismissed the HOA's claims against Jack entirely. Then, she addressed the counterclaim. The Clearwater Shores HOA knowingly and repeatedly violated property boundaries, built unauthorized structures, and profited from land they did not legally possess. I find in favor of the plaintiff, Jack Miles. She awarded him damages, the full $2.8 million in backdated rent and profits. On top of that, she ordered the HOA to dismantle all encroaching structures and reimburse Jack's legal fees in full. Martin Blake didn't look up. His hands were clenched on the table. The courtroom exploded after the ruling. Some residents cheered, others walked out in stunned silence. A few, including board members who had voted with Martin, kept their eyes glued to the floor. The fallout was immediate. Martin resigned that night. The rest of the board followed within the week, either stepping down voluntarily or being voted out during an emergency community meeting that drew record attendance. The HOA's legal reserves were drained, their insurance carrier pulled coverage, and the association was forced to freeze all amenities, maintenance, and community events. Indefinitely. Jack was offered a seat on the new board. He declined. I didn't drain the lake to get a title, he told them. I did it so no one else would get bulldozed. He spent the next few weeks restoring the lake bed in his section. He brought in native plants, placed boulders for natural erosion control, and installed a small private pier, just enough for one canoe. He didn't look for thanks. He didn't need praise. What he got instead was respect, from neighbors, who had once whispered behind his back, from those who realized silence was the only thing that had allowed the HOA's empire to grow, and from Martin Blake, who never showed his face in Clearwater Shores again. 3 months later, the lake still hadn't recovered, the pumps were long gone, the lawsuits settled, and the caution tape around the HOA's beloved clubhouse fluttered listlessly in the breeze. What used to be the glimmering heart of Clearwater Shores now looked like the bones of a failed empire. Sun-bleached docks, stuck in cracked mud, paddleboards forgotten in storage, weeds growing through once perfect pavers. Jack watched it all. From his back porch with quiet detachment, he hadn't refilled his portion of the lake. He had no intention to. Instead, he had transformed it not into a playground, but a sanctuary. He hired a wetlands specialist to help him replant native reeds and wild grasses. A shallow marsh began to form at the far edge of his property. Frogs returned first, then herons. Jack spent his mornings in a folding chair beside the small pier he built, sipping coffee and watching dragonflies skim across the water. It wasn't just beautiful, it was untouchable. The HOA, under the guidance of an entirely new board, had extended multiple olive branches. They begged for a shared use agreement. They offered generous lease payments for marina access. One even proposed naming a new walking trail after him. Jack declined each one with a calm smile and a simple phrase. Some boundaries don't need to be redrawn. They need to be remembered. The resort side of the lake stayed dry. With no access to water, the clubhouse lost its luxury appeal. Bookings vanished. The boat rental service shut down permanently. Realtors struggled to sell homes near the now empty basin, and property values dipped as rumors of lawsuits and bad management continued to circulate. And then, quietly, Jack sold his house. He listed it without fanfare. No open houses, no signs. A private buyer, someone who respected the land and had no interest in rebuilding what Jack had undone, took the offer within 3 days. Jack left behind the pier, the marsh, and a fully documented conservation easement protecting the new wetland from future development. But before he left Clearwater Shores, he made one final stop. It was a clear morning, just after sunrise. He walked down the path to the old marina, now abandoned and silent. The clubhouse loomed in the background, its windows dark. At the edge of the cracked dock, he hammered a single wooden stake into the dry earth. Atop it, he placed a sign, "Private property, trespassers will be drained." No threats, no names. Just a sharp memory of everything that had happened. The photo of that sign would end up on a dozen neighborhood Facebook pages. Some laughed, some called it petty, others called it perfect. Jack never commented. He never explained it. He simply got into his truck, nodded once to his empty shoreline, and drove away. No press conference, no farewell speech, just the quiet retreat of a man who had fought one and left no loose ends. Back in town, people still talk about him. They tell the story like a myth now. The homeowner who drained the lake, the man who sank a million marina with a deed and a pump. Teenagers dare each other to sneak down to the empty docks. New residents hear whispers and think it's all exaggeration, but the mud doesn't lie. And the man who walked away from it, he didn't need a lake to make waves. He just needed a reason. And once they gave him that, they never stood a chance.